Good morning, and welcome to our visitors again. Before we open up to the book of Exodus to continue in our Exodus series, let me take a quick moment and say thank you, a long overdue thank you, I think, from me to you. Thank you for allowing me to be your preacher, and also thank you for hiring me as your preacher and giving a financial sacrifice out of your means so that I can be here. I cannot be here without you. And it's because of you that I get to be here. So I humbly thank you for that. The book of Exodus. We'll be in Exodus more chapter 12 today rather than looking at this final plague. However, this final plague plays a lot into what's about to happen as we are going to look at the Passover in chapter 12, right? This Passover is really important. But what's interesting about this very first Passover is when it takes place, right? So we've been talking about 9 plagues. We looked at chapter 7 to 10, we looked at these first 9 plagues, and we made this comparison to the reaction of Moses and Pharaoh and all that God was doing in this moment. And then God announces to Pharaoh in chapter 11 through Moses, for the last time, there's this final plague that's going to come. There's this plague of death that will come, and it will take the firstborn, no matter what their status, what their position, even the beast of the field will be judged by God in this final plague. But before this final plague takes place, but after the warning of it, we pause for the Passover, right? We pause for this very first memorial feast. Now, how often before a big event, before something major, do people pause for a moment and just do a little bit of reflection or a little bit of thinking? Think about all the times that happens, right? What happens in the locker room before a game? You get kind of a motivational speech. You get this communal moment, right? What happens before something else major, like before surgery? Surgeons will gather with some doctors and they'll just take a 2-minute silence. They're all gloved up, they're washed up, the hairnet is on, they've got the apron on, and the whole staff that's going to do this operation, right before they go into the operating room, they pause for 2 minutes. They take a quick breath, and then they go into surgery. You take this pause moment to just reflect and center yourself. And so the Passover is in this pause of a moment after you've had all of this chaos of the 9 plagues on Egypt, and right before a major moment of this last plague, and then the deliverance of Egypt, which is where we find ourselves today. And this Passover celebrates almost 2 things. First, it celebrates the future aspect where they are getting ready for what God has promised he would do for them. They're getting ready for their deliverance and to be their own people. And so the Passover celebrates what God is about to do for us, as well as what God has already done in hearing our plea and our cry and honoring his covenant that he established and keeping Israel safe during all of these plagues and putting that judgment on Egypt. And so the Passover centers between the past and the future as well, which is vital to understand, especially as not only are we looking at the Passover of the future and how it memorials the past, but how this Passover reflects Christ and how Christ reflects the Passover, really. And so with all of that backdrop, let's understand the Passover first before we start looking at all these different time elements, especially this one about Christ. In Exodus chapter 12, we have the explanation of what's supposed to happen in the Passover. And I'll just summarize it for you so we don't fall asleep reading through almost a whole chapter here. But in the first 3 verses of the Passover, you have a time element there where God is almost establishing a new calendar. Actually, it kind of is. He says to Israel, this is the first month for you. Consider this the first month, and in this month, every year that it comes around, you will celebrate this feast that I'm about to tell you about. This is a brand new time for you. It's almost like you're going to be your own people with your own calendar, whatever the other calendar is. Now this one is for you. Remember it. And what you're going to do is you're going to take a lamb. And what's important about this lamb is that it's without blemish. You're going to take the lamb that's without blemish. And at the same time, at twilight, everybody is going to take that lamb, and they're going to slay that lamb, and then they're going to take the blood of that lamb, and they're going to put it in a basin, and they'll mix it with hyssop, and they're going to mark their door of the place where they're staying. And within that place, you're going to eat this lamb. And the way that you're going to eat this lamb is not raw or boiled. What you're going to do is you're going to roast this lamb with fire, and you're going to eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. What an appetite, right? You're going to eat it like this. And not only are you going to just have it to eat, it's not going to be a leisure meal. You got to eat it in haste. And the attire, the dinner uniform, is going to be a belt on your waist and shoes on your feet and a staff in your hand. It's very casual, actually. A lot of us might be about that. And then there's going to be this moment where God is going to pass over you his judgment on this final plague. You'll be in the house with the feast, with the blood on the door, and because that blood is there, that's going to be a signal between you and me, God says, that I won't strike your firstborn, but I will go into Egypt and strike their firstborn. And in the future, you're going to consider this a memorial feast. This will be something to remind you of this grand event when your generations ahead of you eat this. And it's expected that generation after generation after generation will come together once a year to have this feast. And also in the future, you got to remove all of the leaven out of your house like a week before you partake of this memorial. And there's only certain people that can partake of this memorial. It's only the circumcised. It's only God's people that can partake of this Passover. And so you already see this future event when God is talking about the generations to come and what they're going to do, while it also memorializes the past. But real quick, as we're right before we look at this in the future, how important do you think it is to partake in this Passover at this very first time? How important do you think that is? That's pretty important, I say. How demoralizing would it be if somebody in Israel was like, it's kind of a lot of work, don't really want to do that, or I don't think it's too important, Well, that'd be pretty wrong. You can imagine the uproar that would come with all of the neighbors. It's like, you need to move your house. I'll paint the blood on your door for you. Just don't be there. It was critical for everybody to partake of this and to know what it was about and what they were supposed to do, including in the future. Because look at all of the future elements that God is establishing right now in the present moment. It's like a new beginning. There's this long-term future that I have with you where you're going to have your own calendar. And so you can expect to be my people for a long time, almost as long as you can count the days, right? This is a brand new time for you, Israel. And not only that, but you're going to have children that are going to remember this time. So get ready for generations and for you to have kids that are going to memorialize this and teach them about it so that they know who I am and what I did for you. And make sure that this is a statute forever. That means you're going to have the freedom to celebrate this moment right here again and again and again. And then also know that since there's only a certain people that can partake of it, that means that you are not going to be the foreigners in somebody else's land. You're going to be a free people where people come and visit you. You're going to have your own land. Oops. I don't even know if that works. But now, you are going to have to discover in your own land what it's like to be your own people and say, you are not part of God's people, and so you can't take a part of this feast. But that's long in the future, so get ready for being in a relationship with God in the long term, but also get ready for what's about to happen in the immediate future. This final plague is supposed to take place at midnight. It's at night. And at twilight, people are supposed to slay the lamb. And they're getting ready to eat this lamb. And they almost have to stay awake all night to eat this lamb because they're going to need that sustenance for the next day when God delivers them, when Egypt drives Israel out. And you got to eat all of this lamb that it says. You want to eat as much as you can, and you can't take the leftovers with you. What's left over, you got to burn in the fire outside. You can't take it with you, but you need that sustenance right now. And you got to eat it in haste because you got to be ready to go for this next future that I'm about to present to you. And you have to eat with the belt on and the staff in the hand and shoes on your feet for the exact same reason. Get ready to go. It's happening right now. And so here's all of this, and besides all of that, God has already planned for them all of the financial needs that they are going to need when God told Moses, tell Israel to collect gold and silver from the Egyptians. They're just going to give it away to get these people out of their land. Exodus chapter 11, verse 1, Moses still in the court of Pharaoh, probably for the last time here. It says this, before the instructions of the Passover, Exodus 11:1 says this, the Lord said to Moses, yet one more plague I will bring upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterward he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will drive you away completely. Speak now in the hearing of the people that they ask every man his neighbor and every woman her neighbor for silver and gold jewelry. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of all the people. Before even establishing the Passover, God is getting them ready for a future, and he's almost provided a whole economy for them out of somebody else's means. Incredible, right? See how far forward God is looking? And then he says, okay, now get ready to remember everything that I did for you. And so the Passover is calling Israel to observe where they are right now. Where are we right now after we've suffered so long as slaves? And let's look to the future that we have with this God that has hurt us. What's our future like with this God? Because in the future, we're going to be looking at the past at this moment right here. We're going to be celebrating and taking part of this feast to remember how God made us our very own people. And so we will sacrifice this lamb. It'll be like a sacrificial lamb that you would find in Leviticus chapter 3, which was the peace offering. These are the only two sacrifices that you eat. The peace offering and the Passover. And it's interesting how close these are because it's almost like you can celebrate that Israel had peace with God in this moment, especially when God was in total control and Israel understood we can't do anything without God. I'm sure that might be difficult more for some people like myself where I like a lot of control and a lot of organization. But for others, this was probably the best thing ever when they realized I don't have to take responsibility for anything because God has done it all. And then there was this blood that was like, we're going to remember this sign of agreement where God wouldn't judge us. Instead, he passed over us because we were covered by the blood and he put his judgment on Egypt. That's something to remember in the future. And then there's this element of the feast that you eat together. How many times do we eat in our own feasts here, or our own holidays here in America, right? You almost expect to be eating all the time. I mean, even after church, we're probably going to go eat with each other, right? And that is a very peaceful moment. It's almost something we expect to do because we're a family. But in this feast, it's something that they're going to celebrate every single time. You have to eat this with unleavened bread because you are a separated people. I separated you from Egypt. You're not like them. You are my people, unleavened and pure. And so you'll remove that leaven from your house in the future to remember how you were removed and how you are a separated people. Not only that, but you're going to be eating this feast with bitter herbs to remind you of the bitterness of slavery that you were in. It's interesting that God would call them to remember the bad times, to remember how bitter it was without God every single year. Unfortunately, in the future, Israel will not always remember the bitterness of slavery, and they will be somewhat of slave masters themselves and make people's lives bitter. Too bad this feast didn't call to them every single day. But right now, God is telling them, eat this with bitter herbs to remember the bitterness that you were in before me. And you'll wear the same clothes to remember how ready you were to be delivered and to be set free. And you'll remember how I passed judgment over you and I judged your oppressor in this feast. And that's critical for you to remember how I withheld the plagues from you and showed you favor. That's something to remember. And so the Passover calls Israel not just to look to the future of what God is going to do for them, but also everything that he has done for them in the past. It centers them, and both ways looks at how God is doing everything and how they can do nothing without him. And every time that they are to partake of this feast year over year, it was to remind them of the exact same thing. This is what God has done for us. And because of this, we will continue to hold this feast and think about everything God will bless us with in the future. Now, you already agreed how critical it was for them to hold this Passover the first time. How important do you think it is to hold it every single year as it was scheduled? What do you think their attitude would be like in the future if they decided that this Passover is really not so necessary or something so memorable? What does that communicate to you about their relationship with God? Because there was a long stretch there where they decided that they weren't going to celebrate the Passover. Whether that was because of bad leadership or something else, there were years of it. Look here in 2 Chronicles 35, 16 to 19. In this passage, we're talking about Josiah. And we will consider Josiah a good king, especially because he has a desire to serve God. And after they find the book of Moses in verses 12 and 13 of 2 Chronicles 35, you get this institution of this Passover feast that seems to have been long forgotten, and finally somebody realizes, this is here, we got to celebrate this. 2 Chronicles 35:16 says this, so all the service of the Lord was prepared that day to keep the Passover and to offer burnt offerings on the altar of the Lord according to the command of King Josiah. And the people of Israel who were present kept the Passover at that time and the feast of unleavened bread 7 days. No Passover like it had been kept in Israel since the days of Samuel the prophet. That's a long time. None of the kings of Israel had kept such a Passover as was kept by Josiah, and the priests and the Levites and all Judah and Israel who were present in the habitates of Jerusalem in the 8th year of the reign of Josiah. The Passover was kept. Imagine how powerful that Passover was. I think it describes it accurately, how grand it was to celebrate the Passover once again. This is everything that God has done for us. This is why we are who we are. This is everything that God had promised us. That's something for us to celebrate once again. And you can look all the way into the Gospels and realize that the Passover in the Gospel of John is recorded as coming up 3 times. This is generally how we get the understanding of the 3-year ministry of Jesus. John 2:13, John 6:4, it talks about how the Passover was at hand. And then finally, John 13:1, such an important chapter, talks about how the Passover was happening, and it was the very feast that Jesus was celebrating with his disciples right before he was betrayed. Does that sound like a major moment to you? Does that sound like a feast before a major moment? It should. And look how much more the Passover reflects Christ and Christ the Passover here. 1 Corinthians 5, 7 through 8, Paul kind of puts it pretty plain when he says here, for Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. He makes this comparison. And it's familiar to us to see Jesus as the lamb, especially in the first chapter of John, when John the Baptist points at Jesus and says, behold, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. And you see in Revelation, as we've studied on Wednesday, where Jesus is the lamb that was slain that opens the seals. And here in 1 Corinthians, you have Christ is the Passover lamb. Let us therefore celebrate the Passover not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Paul is doing the same thing that I'm trying to do here and communicate the separation here and how important this emblem is. But Christ, being the Passover lamb, almost reflects identically what was happening in Exodus chapter 12. Jesus was establishing a new time before this Passover. I'm not talking about AD in the year of our Lord Anno Domini, although that kind of fits here. What I'm talking about is Jesus is establishing a new covenant and is about to do that on the death on the cross. We're getting rid of an old covenant, and now it is a new time where everybody can be in my kingdom. And Jesus is that lamb that is without blemish, the only kind of lamb that could be accepted. And it was the shedding of Jesus' blood that cleanses us and makes us clean, and so the judgment of God passes over us. Back in Exodus chapter 12, it talks about how hyssop was supposed to be used with the blood. When Jesus was on the cross and was given a sponge to drink from, what kind of reed was used to lift up that sponge? Hyssop. Hyssop has purifying qualities, and you'll see this in the Psalms where the psalmist would say, "Cleanse me, purify me with hyssop." Quite a reflection there. And Jesus is celebrating the Passover feast the night that he was betrayed. And they were all probably reflecting, as Jesus had been there with the Father in heaven, about everything that God had done previously, and were celebrating that Passover when judgment was once passed over Israel and now will be passed over all who will be found in Christ. And it was something that Jesus also established as a new memorial feast, something that we just did. The Lord's Supper. And there's only certain people that can partake of this Lord's Supper here. And this Lord's Supper calls us to reflect about what God has done for us. What Christ has already done for us that we couldn't do in the bitterness of our sin, only God could deliver us from. And it centers us between that past and the future that we still have yet to look forward in a distant, long-term future in heaven, and in an immediate future in our immediate relationship with God and all that he has blessed us. You see how important this Passover is? It's so important. We want to celebrate this not once a year, but every single Sunday. Is that important to you? How important is it to you to partake of this? How important is it to you to think about everything that Christ has done for you and will do for you? That should be worth celebrating and looking forward to celebrate. This memorializing Christ centers us between the future with God and what God will do for us in the past of all that God has done for us. But even outside of this moment on Sundays, how often before a big event do you just stop by yourself and think about all that God is going to do for you and has done for you? Not in this feast, maybe in a moment of prayer, reflection, song. You're about to encounter something new in your life. Do you stop and take the 2 minutes that a surgeon would, a time, an evening, as you would in the Passover, and think, God, I am about to embark on a new position in work, and I know that you will guide me through this new position because I have seen everything that you have done for me before. God, you're about to move me into a brand new place, and I know that you will guide me into the future, and your will be done in this because I have seen everything that you have done that I couldn't do in my past. God, you're moving me into a new church. You're moving me into applying for a new position. You're moving me into a family, a brand new situation. And God, I know that you are with me in the future because you have always been with me in the past. Even in the critical moments, you provided for me when I didn't think I was going to be able to provide for myself. And moreover, you have spiritually made me a connection with you. And I know that you will hold that covenant connection with us. How often do you do that? How often do you stop and think about that, especially before a major moment, a changing moment in your life? May we never think that we don't have time or a moment to reflect on everything that God has done for us and will do for us. May we never think we don't have a moment to memorialize everything that God has done for us and will do for us. And so you have the Passover of Exodus chapter 12 that inspires us to do the same thing when God has done everything. And considering all of this, God has set you free from sin, the bitterness of sin. And you can be washed free and clean of that in baptism. And God is giving that to you, to be in a new relationship, a new time forevermore with Him. And God is also offering prayer between you and Him to make that connection and be healed in that connection with Him. He offers it, but you have to do it. If either of these are your needs, you can see me at the back while we reflect on everything that God has done for us. When we sing this song, there's a fountain free, number 287.
Stand.